back to Deep Thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to talk about a subject that I sort of refer to often, but I haven't done an explicit episode on it, and I think that it has a lot of benefits when thinking about it. So I want to go into it, which is the electronic universe. There is a field of science called cosmology, and cosmology is the study of the universe, the stars, of the planets, and more importantly, all of the laws of physics and laws of electricity that actually govern the universe. And what's really interesting is that the study of the stars and the planets and all that was pretty observational. People used the naked eye first, looking up at the stars. Started tracking the fact that, wow, they got this big ball that circles around us. All the stars seem to go around in a circle. And then they started studying planets, and they kind of went in a different rotation. And then they started studying the moons around planets, and those went in a different rotation. And they for any of you who've studied, ancient astronomy, they started creating the firmament dome theory. And, of course, it's written in biblical form in many religions as well. It's where the flat earth community begins their journey. We're going to stay with heliocentric for this entire conversation. And I guess I should say right away that I think I've made my final decisions about the whole flat earth thing. I do think it's a ball. I do think that expanding Earth is probably the number one reason why I think it's a ball. But the other big reason is that the stars in the southern hemisphere are visible from multiple points in the south, and that wouldn't be possible if it was stretched out on some disk and very far away from each other, right? They wouldn't see them at the exact same place they see them, let's put it that way. And there's a lot of counter theories to that within the flat earth community, so have at it. But for me, looking out at the stars and seeing things round, seeing planets round and moons round and that sort of thing, locks it in for me. But expanding Earth is the number one reason why. And it's going to have a big part to do with this episode as well. That doesn't mean I think that NASA has a picture of the Earth from space. I don't think they do. I think they have a bunch of crappy impersonations because none of the pictures remotely look the same. And I don't just mean the color tones. I mean the proportions of the continents, the cut and pasting of, cloud systems within a single shot. It's pretty pathetic. The blue marble shot that came back from Apollo 17 had a screwed up Black Sea that was then later corrected without telling the world that it was corrected, because I believe it was composited of high altitude plains. I think it also has a major proportion problem for the continent of Africa and the placement of Madagascar, as related to even the totally incorrect map of Google Earth, which does not follow the Peter projection map. And hopefully I've pronounced those things well enough that you can look them up if you want to look them up. But that's the end of that. So what's gone on in the scientific community is that they observed the stars and they observed the planets and the moons just by sheer, I guess, good eyesight a long time ago. And I should digress and say quickly that I believe that the reason why our eyesights are bad in the world today, and they were far superior in the recent past, is that we didn't travel much. And so we bred with people that were in our communities and our tribes and didn't leave those communities and tribes very often. And when we finally migrated and started crossbreeding with other humans that were of different sizes from us, I think we got bad eyesight. And it's very simple that if you have a 6'5" person having sex with a 5' person, even though the eyeballs are pretty much stabilized in their size all around the world, right? A giant has relatively the same eyes as a person who's shorter. There still is a difference in its diameter and where the DNA and protein patterns want to take that diameter, which is why we have over age, we have stigmatisms where the eyeball turns into a football and doesn't focus properly on the back of our eyeball. And so I believe that bad eyesight metabolized, and we'll stabilize our eyesight again in probably a few thousand years once we've crossbred enough that we're all pretty much the same height again, same size. But who knows how long that recessive gene can last. So the reason why I believe that they were able to look up at the stars and see them a lot clearer in the older age was due to that fact. Okay? So transportation is directly responsible, in my opinion, for bad eyesight. Interesting, right? Even if two European communities moved to the United States and crossbred when they wouldn't have crossbred had they stayed in their relative place in the European communities. And I have nothing against crossbreeding, trust me. So, the next step up was that man had figured out how to create a telescope. They figured out how to take natural formed glass, and they learned how to forge glass, and they were able to grind it with various oils and sands and create these shapes that magnified things. It was probably simply a serendipitous mistake that someone probably found glass that was created on a beach due to lightning, or anywhere there's sand in a lightning storm. You've seen these beautiful trees of glass that create once lightning blasts the earth, right? And placing their hand behind it, they could see, once they clean the thing off, there's magnification. And you take smart people for a few hundred years and they'll figure out that it's the bend in the glass that refracts and magnifies. So we got the instrumentality of, lens telescopes. Later, I think, can't remember when a reflector telescope was created, but I think it was late 1800s or so. I could be wrong. My physics teacher was a really smart kid, and he actually ground his own lens in a tree stump at the age of 13 so he could have a lens telescope. That's my teacher. The guy was brilliant. He also built our star projector from scratch by drilling every single star up to, I believe, about 2,100 stars in a star projector he built for our school. Amazing guy. But once we got instrumentalities to look deeper into space, we got a lot more information about the planets and the moons and their positioning and their rotations, and these folks were pretty decent with math. And so they were able to predict where everything was going to be. And again, for a while, they had the glass firmament model with spheres that they had to attach to the glass, and then little tiny spheres attached to those spheres to account for the moons. And it got really complicated really quick, which is why when Copernicus and all these other folks came along and started repositioning where the Earth was relative to the sun, we started to figure out, wow, it makes a lot more sense when things rotate around each other, right? But then the next big epiphany in science started with a man named Faraday. And Faraday was really the first grandfather of electricity. And, his laboratory was made out of wood, wire, and magnets, he said. And when he started seeing people have a lot more instrumentalities to run tests, he was like, look, you can use this stuff, but you really don't need it. I was able to pioneer the understanding of electricity with almost nothing. And then, of course, the sort of crescent peak on that summit of electrical research was done by a guy named Nikola Tesla, who lived quite a few years, was an absolute phenomenon of human nature. This gentleman was capable of designing machines in his mind and testing them in his mind. He was so good at doing this that he was able to age ball bearings in his brain for a couple years before building the equipment. And so every day he would check in his brain and age the ball bearings in his mind, the wear and tear that he understood that they would suffer if put in a particular configuration at a particular diameter, a particular lubrication. And he was able to adjust that design in his mind, and he would build machines perfectly the first time. As Mark Twain said, who was I apologize, I forgot his real name, but he was a very routine customer of Tesla's shows in New York, and he commented several times that none of Tesla's machines had wires, so they were never plugged into a wall socket. His ceiling was lit by some ambient force. There were no bulbs up there. And so he said, when you walk into his place, you're walking into the future. Way into the future. Tesla is responsible for alternating current and the wireless communication systems that we have today, and pretty much all the inventions that were folded into the HARP antenna system, which we will not cover in this episode. But electricity was massively understood by the early 20th century, and I mean massively understood. The fundamentals of the universe were massively understood, including gravity was completely explained by Faraday and all of their clan up to Tesla. There's another gentleman by the name of Steinmetz, who was a mathematician who simplified a lot of their equations to make them more understandable, including simplifying a lot of Einstein's equations. But then we get Einstein. Einstein's under a lot of scrutiny right now by some scholars who believe that in acting as a patent clerk, which when I was a kid I heard the word clerk and I always thought, oh, he took money. Patent clerks are individuals that certify, allow in and certify various inventions to be patented. And we know from the Wright brothers, who flew in 1903, that the patent office is not your friend sometimes, at least back in those days. I'm not sure where it is today. I think if you try to patent a zero-point energy system, you'll find it very difficult because the patent office has been told that certain inventions are simply forbidden to be patented because they are impossible to create. And those arbitrary decisions were made decades and decades before those inventions were refined and made possible. So when the Wright brothers brought in their proof that they had flown in 1903, the patent office said it was a hoax, couldn't happen, even though they had a photograph, I believe, flying about 43 feet in the air. Wright brothers crashed a lot too and nearly died several times. But it wasn't until one of the brothers took the invention to the Paris Air Show and flew, and Paris, France, or the country of France, said they would patent flight under the name of France, and the Wright brothers, that the American government finally rescinded their bullshit theory and said, okay, fine, no, we're actually going to patent it here because the application was actually applied here recently in 1907, and we're going to beat you to the punch. There's a bunch of stories about how they were using, like, us being hours ahead of France to say we did it first, but I'm not quite sure how that went down. A buddy of mine wrote a great script about the brothers that pulled a lot of that evidence together for me. But physics became a very interesting tool to really stifle our research into electricity. And in doing so, they erased the previously well-understood theory of gravity, which we're going to redo. We've done it several times on the show, but it's part of this electrical universe, even though it's probably it's a property of electricity, but it's not, well, you'll see. But the J.P. Morgans of the world, who figured out that Nikola Tesla had figured out how to build an antenna that would rob the atmosphere of its ethereal power, route that power into the core of the earth, and siphon off out of the bowels of the earth infinite power. One of Tesla's most famous experiments proved that this works in his Tesla coil that he created in Colorado. And Tesla built a coil and drove a minute amount of power down into the Earth's crust and pulled out enough power to have a standing lightning bolt for 1 minute until he broke the circuit. So imagine that most of us have heard a lightning bolt for a split second. He had a bolt going for 60 seconds. Purely pulled out of the bowels of the earth. And he said, I'm done. I've got what I need to build my antenna. So he builds an antenna that can provide the world with infinite power forever. He also invented a way to transmit that power to our homes safely and be constituted into usable AC power in the home. And when J.P. Morgan and his buddies figured out that he was going to be making free energy, and J.P. Morgan wanted to monetize it, they had him tear down his tower. And then miraculously, physics erased the notion of what he had done. Said that there were no free energy sources in the world. You must buy it from an energy company. And we know the rest of that story, right? So this, went through relativity, general relativity, special relativity. Soon enough, quantum mechanics came around, refining it even further. And then the cosmologists of the universe finally started getting massively powerful telescopes and started melding theory into astronomy because there's just simply too much out there that's unknown. And they don't like unknowns as scientists, right? You don't get a lot of awards in this world for proving a negative, only for proving a positive. And what this did in our era that is unfortunate, but it's starting to unravel itself beautifully, because a lot of the cosmologists that were raised with Newtonian physics, quantum mechanics, are starting to realize that the entire universe, and even life on Earth, behaves in an electrical pattern. Everything. Now, if you watch a lot of these shows, you'll hear me reference the fact that I believe that the researcher Eric Dollard is correct in his exploration of Faraday through Tesla, through Steinmetz, through all the physicists and quantum mechanics. And by getting privileged information from the Navy and RCA, they flat out told him in the late 70s that the sun has a plasma core, and that the Earth and all bodies in space have plasma cores. What does that mean? Well, raise your hand if you were told that the Earth has a nickel core. Right? Raise your hand if you've seen a diagram of all the gases that supposedly make up the interior of the sun. Raise your hand if you've seen any proof of any of that. I mean, physical proof. Scientists that have sent a drone to the center of the Earth to confirm what's down there. Sent a probe to the center of the sun to confirm what's in there. Obviously, it's a ludicrous question because no one has. And you might just simply chalk it up to saying, well, it's too hot, man. Can't do it. It's okay. Well, then you can't claim what's in there. Now, what's really fascinating is you have Einstein creating his crown jewel, which is E equals mc squared, right? Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. So as soon as mass moves a certain speed, we classify it as energy again. And when energy slows down, we classify it back into mass. All right, seems pretty cool. But the interesting thing is that's the clue you need to understand an electrical universe. What is electricity? Well, in this world, it's electrons moving on a conductive surface. This conductive surface is called the valence. And it essentially plays swap with the one next to it. Tells the next one to move over, move over, move over. And that agitation of electrons on the surface of a conductive material creates the flow that we know as electricity. If nothing can provide a void for the electricity to move, the electricity pretty much stays in its place, which is why your power outlets don't just leak lightning bolts. You have to plug something in, which creates a vacuum of need for a circuit to move. And it has a conductive wire that goes up to a conductive circuit that completes a light bulb, turns your computer on, all that good stuff. But if something isn't plugged in, it pretty much stays where it is. But they assert that everything in the universe is made of energy. If it's slow, it's mass. If it's fast, it's energy, right? But it's all energy, every bit of it. Well, what do they tell you about sunspots? Sunspots create gigantic coronas, big arms of combustible material that come off the surface of the sun. They got videos of these things, right? They don't tell you that 97% of it comes back into the crust of the sun right away, and that only a tiny percentage ever spits out into the universe. And because we have horrible models of how big the sun is compared to the Earth, we think that we're actually in harm's way. That the tiny bit of diffusing material coming off the sun poses any threat to the Earth. When I was in astronomy class, one of the first exercises we did was to get perspective of how small everything is and how far away everything is in the universe. In the solar system. So my teacher took a basketball, which is about 10 inches in diameter, and he said, okay, this is going to be the sun, and we are going to draw on pieces of paper all the 9 planets that we have in existence. And yes, Pluto is still a planet and still is in my heart. But Earth was approximately about a third of a period on a piece of paper. That's how tiny it was. I believe the distance I had Earth, which was funny. And so he says, draw this on a piece of paper. And of course, it's impossible. Really, you have to just sort of nick it with a piece of ink or something. But he goes, when we get out there on the front lawn of the school, you're going to be 36 feet away from the basketball, somewhere in that realm. 32, 36, somewhere in there. And everyone else took another planet. And we put the ball on literally one end of the school on the front yard. I had to walk 36 feet out and put a needle in the ground. And right there, you're just looking at absurdity. You know, in terms of how far away we are. We're a speck of dust circling this basketball. And you can imagine Mercury and Venus are smaller than Earth, so they're even tinier specks. And Jupiter's definitely visible on a piece of paper. And it was quite a ways down the street. But we had to stop around Saturn because we were going to end up walking downtown. It's a small town, but it was going to be several blocks away. And then my teacher said, who has Pluto? Someone raised their hand, and he goes, okay, you need to walk 500 miles from the North Pole. Put that in the ground. And of course, it's a joke. But right away, the students realized just how sparse space really is. That's important to remember. But I've got a couple things I need to remind you guys. And again, for those of you who watch every single episode, I apologize. We have to repeat ourselves about gravity. And I have to repeat myself about what an electron really is, just to kind of get that in the book of knowledge here. If you pull up Wikipedia right now and you look up the word gravity, you'll notice in the first sentence they're going to use the word phenomenon. Phenomenon is obviously not a certainty. It is a mystery when you call it a phenomenon. Gravity obviously provides, if you could harness it, if you knew what it was and you could harness it, well, geez, think about what you could do. Perpetual motion machine? A cinch. Creating electricity? Very easy. Escaping this planet? Potentially really easy. Think about the people who've worked really hard to control this planet. Imagine if we're all willy-nilly moving around. What would war be? People could just get out of the way. They're going to attack the Middle East? Well, the Middle East is going to go to the moon for now, till you guys calm down. It's terrifying for them, for us to gain this power. I'm not sure they really worry about gravity because they think we're pretty stupid. But here we're going to go into a little bit of repeat. So hang in there if you've already heard this. Faraday through Tesla had proven that there's something in the universe called ether. They used a really long wire, and they'd wave it around, and they could sense ether particles. And Faraday was in the 1860s, and Tesla was late 1800s, early 1900s, right? But they both tracked in different experiments that ether exists and that it moves 50 times the speed of light. Pretty much a constant. And that's some fast stuff, let me tell you, right? Eric Dollard in the late 70s did the same exact experiment, I believe with a 7-foot wire, and came up with the exact same measurement. It's just apparently very easy to determine once you put the right equipment together. And Eric Dollard's a guy that by 1987, he had configured longitudinal circuits together on a tabletop, filmed it. You can go watch these. It's called the Borderland Society. They're old videos, with VHS tapes, but he shows you he beats the speed of light by 11 times through an electrical circuit, just using longitudinal waves through a circuit. Using transverse waves, it was under the speed of light. Longitudinal waves, you got a circuit that travels faster than the speed of light. He did it right there in his basement with 2 other guys, documenting everything. And I mean, it's painfully documented, trust me, right in front of your very eyes. So this proof of ether revealed what an electron was. And it first revealed what gravity was, because without gravity, you don't have an electron. So gravity, if you want to take it out of the phenomenon classification, if you just remember this, you'll always know what gravity is, and everyone else will be none the wiser. But gravity is ethereal winds creating vacuums between objects. What's that mean? It's actually very, very simple, and you've already experienced the principles of ether in your life. Well, one, you're experiencing gravity, but let's just take a different metaphor for ether, and we'll explain it to you real quickly. You have been in a park or an open space with a friend or a loved one. It's actually better for the loved one. And you've had a lot of wind moving around. Perhaps you're looking at them from maybe a couple 100 yards away, and they're walking towards you, and it's a really windy day. You're being tossed all over the place, so are they. 100 feet away, wind's still going crazy, and you see them, but you don't really feel them yet. right? Because there's enough wind pushing on their front, pushing on your front, pushing on your back, pushing on their back. It's all equal. And you're being pulled to the ground, but we'll subtract that out of the equation. It's irrelevant. As you move closer together, your chests will eventually start to feel the other person, probably about a foot away on a really windy day. And you know why this happens. Because their back is blocking a lot of the wind that would be smacking you in the face, that was smacking you in the face a few moments ago when they were a few more feet away. And they're feeling you because your back is blocking the wind hitting them in the chest. There's no information being transferred between your body and their body, meaning there's no communication between the atoms in your body. There's no mass against mass pulling at all. There's no pull. There's only push. If you're standing 6 inches away in a nice windy day, you can really feel the vacuum between you. And you actually start getting pushed together because there's more pressure on your backs than on your fronts. And that's the vacuum of space that the proximity of two objects create. And that's what gravity is. Why does the Earth pull us down? Because it has a plasma core that entirely blocks ethereal winds. Meaning, we have a bunch of ethereal winds hitting us from above, pushing us down to this round object. Now, when the physicists started, they just subtracted it and said ether doesn't exist. They created some stupid experiments which were completely not acknowledging what Tesla and Faraday had discovered, and they just subtracted it. And they did that as a favor to the J.P. Morgan organization to make sure that that never proliferated science studies moving forward and kept us buying units of energy to this day. So that's gravity. Now, you don't need something the size of Earth to create gravity. You need anything that interferes with the winds of ether. An atom is held together by incredible forces, right? As far as we know, when you break one in half, you get fission, and that's a very dangerous expulsion of energy because it then starts splitting atoms next to it, and we get a bomb. And then the attrition of the universe, the inertia of the universe slows the explosion down. That's why it doesn't go forever. Now, I always like to cite the Coral Castle guy at this point because if you read his paper on magnetism, he will tell you that they have essentially misclassified the construction of an atom. This is a guy that moved, hundreds of thousands of pounds of coral rock by himself, with no assistance from other people, and built what's called Coral Castle, of which he then moved several years later, pretty much by himself. I mean, he had people drive the trucks, but he loaded the trucks himself at night. 110-pound guy. People think he used pulleys and stuff, but we'll get to that. But in his paper on magnetism, he says something pretty profound that I've never heard repeated anywhere else. He says you've been lied to about neutrons and neutrons and protons at the center of an atom. He goes, what's really at the center of an atom is a photon, which is a light particle, really light wave, a light collection of energy, which in one classification could simply be called plasma. A plasma I like to describe as the stem cell of energy. Plasma is very useful because it can be anything it wants to be. When it finally settles down, it can turn into whatever it wants to turn into. But regardless if he's right or not, the center of an atom does provide resistance to ether. Remember, any particle in the universe is just a classification of how fast energy moves. It's what a collider does. A collider slams two protons together, and then it measures the speed of everything that popped out, and then it uses sigma 6 algorithm to figure out whether or not it's really a particle or just some ambient energy splashing off the impact. And anything that has a good wave of consistency, they go, that is a particle, and they check an index, and they go, oh, yep, that's a proton. Oh, that's an electron. That's a quark 1, quark 2, whatever. They classify everything. When they find a new particle, they're really excited. Supposedly found the God particle. I don't believe they did. Well, whatever. Go see my episode on the Hadron Collider if you want to know where I am with that. But if you have a little tiny core, a super teeny tiny core that can resist ether, but ether is all over the place, you get two things that are going to occur. They're going to occur. You're going to get ether that actually hits the center of an atom and bounces straight back, perpendicular to the angle that it hit. Or it's going to ricochet, I should say. But then you're going to get particles that are going to go in orbit using that negative pressure model. It's It's going to go in orbit around the center of an atom. The bounce particle is called the dielectric energy wave. It's called dielectric energy. Every wire of electricity has a dielectric pole coming off its center. The orbital energy is called magnetism. Well, they're going to bang into each other because one's going around the outside and one's bouncing back and coming back completely back out into the universe. And so when those two collide, you have electromagnetism. Very important fundamentals of the universe when it comes to power and when it comes to understanding how ether plays a role in this whole thing. Ether creates the classifications of energy because ether participates in the slowing down or speeding up of mass in the universe, energy in the universe, all of it getting classified into these different particles we always talk about. Now, for those of you who get into spin one particles and all that kind of stuff, all that means is that it's got a pretty good unit of entangled energy, and it's spinning, and it has a classification of its momentum and spin and trajectory and all that good stuff, right? You get into the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which is you can only know its position or velocity, not both, right? That's just splitting hairs. So you know that we have this weird thing where the universe seems to have this micro world and this macro world. And there's a lot of similarities when we zoom into things as when we zoom out of things. It seems like the principles of the universe, the mathematical principles of the universe to hold it together, seem to behave pretty much the same at a small level as it does in a big level, right? Not exact. You don't go down and see galaxies spinning in your Cheerios, but you might see the spinning of the water draining in a drain and go, wow, that's a lot like they say the galaxy works, right? But the introduction of the theory that the sun has a plasma core is really profound. And I didn't hear this first until I watched a special on Eric Dollard. And again, the way you ingest Eric is to understand that pretty much over 95% of what he does, which is a service to mankind, as he goes back and he gets the old documentation that our forefathers of electricity discovered, and he reads it back to us, and he deciphers it to make it more accessible to us, right? But now think about the sun. Gigantic ball of plasma, meaning it's a gigantic gravity pool that holds everything that comes into its path because it's creating a massive negative pressure in all directions. So when you have perhaps even Einstein's pool table theory of relativity waves of gravity, space-time continuum waves, it's exactly the same thing. The waves look exactly the same, but it's actually made of ether. There's this recent discovery of gravity waves. Well, those waves are shaped exactly like the way ether would shape waves, just so you know. And, there's the big theory that Einstein's gravity theories are true because they looked at stars behind the sun during a solar eclipse. And their interpretation of what was happening was that space-time was bending, when all that's happening is that ether is so powerful that it can bend light. It can give light a different path. Same thing. Same different theories that come to the same exact observable reality. But what the cosmologists of this world are now saying, some pretty amazingly profound stuff. They have zoomed up on the surface of the sun, and they have looked at all the boiling surface photographs, I should say, of the sun. And it is their conclusion, by conducting experiments here on Earth using spheres with electrical charges on it and combustible materials on the outside of the sphere, that they move in the exact same wormy behaviors as all of the combustible materials on the surface of the sun. So for them, they're like, wow, this is utterly conclusive. The sun has an electrical core. Now, they didn't introduce, at least the presentations I've seen for hours and hours and hours, they haven't correlated what Eric Dollard says, because I think either they haven't seen it or it's a little too profound to start announcing at press conferences that they have or little study groups that they have, right? But I believe that they're saying the exact same thing. Sunspots, which have never made any sense to me, they're sort of minimized by someone saying, well, you really don't see a sunspot on the sun when you look at it. You have to run it through a bunch of filters, and then it's just that when we filter down the amount of light coming from the sun, at one point there's a black spots on the sun. Now again, Navy and the RCA, because they work together to create the most state-of-the-art radar for the Navy. You got to remember the Navy is sort of the top brass in the military because they were the first tool of absolute superiority when conquering planet Earth. Infantry, well, that's sort of like everyone has infantry, but a lot of, the Spanish and the English mastered the seas. And so that became the top power force. And the Air Force still, I believe, is underneath the Navy. That could have changed in the recent decades, but as I had explained to me less than a decade ago, that's the way it is today. So when I say that Eric Dollard in the late 70s was working with the Navy and RCA as a child prodigy, those are pretty good sources. But they said that the sunspots were actually black portals into the sun. And the reason why you don't see when you look at the sun is obviously the rest of the light. So amazingly powerful around the spots. And they are only spots that you can't see them until you filter it down. But what they told him was you're looking into the bowels of the sun, and it is black. And probably ice cold. Doesn't have to have any power inside of it. Because plasma does not have to take on a thermal signature. A lot of the UFOs that you see are plasma balls that have come out of the surface of the Earth in rocky territories, which are always remote territories on Earth, which is why they say, why do these things always appear in the desert? It's because the rocks in the desert are largely undisturbed by mankind, and they are still rubbing together, and they still have crevices that go way, way down. Even though they're just tiny slivers of quarter-inch to millimeter slivers, plasma energy can wiggle through. And every once in a while, it shifts in the middle of the night and during the day, and lets out a kind of a globular discharge of the plasma energy. And when it goes into the air, one, it's spinning at amazing rotational speeds, RPM. But when you look at it, because it's plasma energy, which again is this fundamental energy of the universe, it's very reflective because nothing can penetrate it. So as photons go up to it, to give you sight of it, it bounces straight back to your eye, but it bounces in the form of a sphere that is a chrome sphere. If it spins enough, it turns into a disk. And so you could see a circle or you could see a disk, and they're chrome. And so you could start seeing UFO saucers. They're unidentified, and they're saucers, and they're spinning. But then we have the Navy and Air Force reporting that these things will shoot in one direction at several thousand miles per hour, way over the velocity of any vehicles that we have, and they turn at right angles and do it again. Then they'll stop and hover for a little while, and they keep doing this until they spin away. Some of them line up together and then shoot off into the what seems to be space. Well, if you know anything about ethereal winds and the atmosphere and how the atmosphere is electrical, even though there's not a lightning storm over your head, there's still electricity all over a blue sky. So these things go up into negative pockets, find safe spots to spin, just like when your plane falls through an air pocket, finds a safe place to spin for who knows what the properties have to be for it to find its holding spot, but it finds a holding spot, then gets disturbed because it's going so fast in a rotational way, it starts spinning off of the atmosphere at thousands of miles per hour, which is probably just a fraction of how fast it's spinning. It stops at the next socket that will give it its holding spot, right? And so these things bounce all over the atmosphere and then eventually dissipate up because there's more pressure down below than above, and so it's going to eventually always go out the top of our atmosphere. As far as them lining up, well, if one sphere is cutting a hole through the atmosphere, burning up whatever it's in its way, if another one happens to be in the vicinity because they happen to all pop out around the same time because of this anomaly in the Earth, you get a bunch of them, they're just going to follow each other. It's like drafting in a stock car race. They like the negative pressure that the other one created. The other one's doing all the work, they're just following in unison. Perhaps when they get in unison, they start working together and their energy compiles, and then poof, they're gone. And they will dissipate. They will eventually just dissipate into the atmosphere or shoot into space for all the hell we know, right? NASA has a lot of photographs or movies of things coming up from Earth and spitting out of the atmosphere and things coming down to Earth and bouncing off the atmosphere. this could be merely residual plasma coming out of the sun or bouncing around the universe, and it's rotating. And so it looks like it has an intelligence, right? It's rotating and turning and bouncing off atmosphere conditions, right? You don't know. But this could be happening all the time, and because we don't look up a lot, and because these things are moving so fast we don't see them until we put them under infrared cameras, you just don't know that they're there. Okay? The government has been experimenting with plasma cannons for at least 3.5 decades from today, 2017, excuse me. So where does this get us? Well, when they started looking at the entire universe in an electrical way, they started looking at galaxies, these pictures of galaxies spinning with these spiral arms. They said that is an electrical pattern. We see it all over on Earth, and it happens through the properties of electricity and the way that mass/electricity/energy works together. But now, if everything has a plasma core, right? Again, NASA has said, and I should have mentioned this more on the moon mission. I did mention it, or not the moon episode, but they said that when they've slammed things into the surface of the moon, which I think we have the technology to do that. They slammed, I guess, a 500-pound piece of copper into the South Pole to try to kick up dust into the atmosphere so they could do a spectral analysis on it to see if there's ice, if there's any sort of what other materials they have there. Of course, we were there 6 times, so we still have questions, right? One, they didn't take any high-resolution photographs of the landing sites. Oopsie. But they hit it, and it rang like a bell. That's what they said. Rang like a bell. That's very interesting, right? The moon is hollow. Okay. Well, that would suggest that it too has a plasma core. But all bodies in space start off as a bud of plasma energy. And because they create gravity, because they block ethereal winds, they then attract all particles in space, all energy that it's slowed down. Now, what the hell the moon's made of, who knows, right? But this started getting the cosmologists to think about an ecosystem of energy. Well, if the whole universe is made of energy, which now they're absolutely certain, I mean, it's a silly thing to say, it's, that this is a revelation, but it actually is, which is really funny. Everything's not like nickel core stuff, right? It's not like we're all a bunch of meteorites that just happen to be round with people on them. They started drawing very interesting diagrams of the bowels of the sun having electromagnetic pulse around it, a bit like the Van Allen belts that we have here on Earth, but they come out of the sun, and they're obviously massive, and they stretch the entire circumference of our solar system, probably way beyond where we can see, but it's there. You could assume, probably pretty safely, that closer to the sun, these poles are probably stronger, and further away from the sun, they're less dense. Okay? Now, I told you that the reason why I don't believe in flat Earth is because of something called expanding Earth. There's a cartoonist named Neil Adams, and he said, he's done many interviews. I think he even did a coast-to-coast interview once, which you can find and listen to on YouTube. If you want to know how to spell his name, just look up Expanding Earth in YouTube. The top video will be his video. I suggest watching the video. You will see him reduce the size of the Earth to a quarter the size of the Earth when the continents were all connected, and then he reverses it back to the way it is, and you'll find out that our oceans are the new soil, and that all the continents connect on all sides. The Pangea Drift is a big bunch of bullshit to, again, further hide the fact that our Earth expands, and that leads to a profound understanding of the universe that is very powerful and very much a threat to our energy corporations in this world. So what's interesting about it is that in the interview he had with, I believe, George Norrie from Coast to Coast, they asked him, why do you think the world expands? And there's even a 3-hour lecture from a different scientist who's been tracking it forever, for over 25 years. He's proven it by using NASA's own satellite equipment and tracking new plates that come out of the bottom of the Pacific and the Atlantic, and he labels them and he watches them grow out of the bowels of this rip that's down the center of the Pacific, which is much weaker than the rip that's down the center of the Atlantic. Thus, the Pacific is bigger because more plates are coming out of the bottom of the Pacific, making it expand faster. And the Atlantic is a little stronger, so it's a little slower and a little smaller. But when they asked Neil, what do you think is making the world expand? He did not elaborate. But at that point in the interview, he starts to talk about something very interesting, which piqued my interest at the time. And he said, I don't know, but I think the answer probably threatens the oil companies. He wouldn't go any further than that, which is really odd. It's not like they would come and murder him or something. But one thing we need to backtrack on is, how did Neil get the idea of expanding Earth? And Neil's much older than I am. I don't know how old he is, but he said he was in college in the 60s, early 60s, which means he'd be around in his mid-70s, I guess. I don't know if he's actually that old, but he said that professors in the early 60s, maybe he's done his research, but he says up until the early 60s, they taught this theory in college as an alternative theory to Pangea drift. And we all know that Pangea drift came out of the 70s. This idea that everything was a big island and the rest of the world was ocean. And somehow, all those continents that are in that island formation from Pangea drift all connect on the other side. I mean, you could take the island and then get rid of all the oceans and you make a soccer ball out of the pattern. It's phenomenal. But he said that expanding Earth theory just disappeared out of the colleges. But then he made this mention about the oil companies. And so I started doing research on expanding Earth. And I started doing, coincidentally, research on the fact that oil has been classified as a fossil fuel. Now, many of you have done your research, and you know it's not a fossil fuel. And I'm going to tell you it's potentially related directly to expanding Earth. But let's finish up on expanding Earth real quick. Neil studied every single photograph of planets and moons that have surfaces with his expanding Earth algorithm, which he painstakingly created with some folks. And it turns out that if you use the expanding Earth algorithm on the moon especially, it collapses beautifully. All those black seas that you see, that we see at night, the darker spots, they all disappear. If you make those disappear as the new soil without an ocean, all these craters start coming together. Half craters start coming back together and making whole craters. And you start to go, oh my God. And the most validating photographic evidence that NASA has been to other planets, and perhaps they know about this theory and they're reverse engineering images to do so, are some of the moons of Jupiter. I think it was Europa, but it may not be Europa. But there's one of the ice, super duper ice moons of Jupiter. He did the reverse engineering algorithm, and I'm telling you, the amount of surfaces that come together, highways that were straight lines that have been ripped apart, all come back together perfectly and make straight lines again. So either NASA has been there with a satellite, or they know about this theory and they're doing a brilliant job fudging photographs. And I sort of don't have enough faith in them to fudge photographs with the knowledge of expanding Earth, especially since it's forbidden from being taught. So maybe that's some evidence they've actually been out there with unmanned vehicles. He does Mars. Very interesting reverse engineering of the giant tear that's in the center of Mars. And he slowly does it, and it's very meticulous, and it follows very specific mathematical principles. It's not willy-nilly, as he says. And he doesn't change the shape of anything other than bringing these creases back together. He reported that the Earth expands... Actually, sorry, it was another lecture. It's about 3.5 hours long. I forgot the guy's name, but I'm sure if you search for expanding Earth presentations, the YouTube video has a big, giant screen to your left. He's on the right, and he goes for several segments, depending on how you've got it. If you see the totally edited together one, it should be over 3 hours long. That guy said that the world had tracked the Geneva Convention, and a bunch of the scientific communities have been tracking the fact that Earth expands about 19 centimeters a year, but they had constantly reformulated the algorithm to calculate that to the point it didn't expand at all, because it provides a clue of how the world works, and that clue will start playing with your understanding of how the universe works and how this classified fossil fuel, oil, is created. It is my belief that having a plasma core to the Earth and a plasma core to the Sun means that they're related. These illustrations that these new electric cosmologists have come up with show that the bowels of the Sun communicates with the bowels of all surrounding bodies, meaning it sort of injects us with its plasma core. Stray particles, stray nuclear matter, stray raw energy goes into the bowels of the Earth, and it comes back to the Sun, and we have this interesting relationship. That's their picture, not mine, right? But what if the world was able to, the Earth and all their planets were able to amass a little bit of the subatomic matter from the sun through this ecosystem that's been illustrated recently in the last 10, 15 years? And again, it's very dangerous for these guys to come out and say that there's a different theory of the universe, because they lose their tenure, they use their retirement, they get fired. It's bad news. And so I think a couple of these guys were self-funded, didn't have any problem with this, with that dependency, so they're able to talk about it. But with this ecosystem of us borrowing energy from the sun infinitely, and because every time we expand, the dartboard gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? If I took you to a pub and I gave you a dartboard that's only 6 inches, across, and it has all the same, scoreboard stuff in it, and I said hit the 20, it's going to be really hard. But if I take you into the next room and I give you one that's 6 feet wide, and I say hit the 20, well, it's a big, giant red patch, right? It's easier. So as the world expands, it becomes a bigger target for this energy, and thus has a bigger gravity wave, and it can absorb more faster. And so the Earth should be exponentially growing faster and faster and faster. It's still minimal, right? But the Earth is around 8,000 miles in diameter. So when you have an 8,000 mile diameter object growing 19 centimeters in a year, that's a lot of growth, right? That would be, technically speaking, about 8 centimeters of dust on this side of the planet and 8 centimeters of dust on the other side of the planet, just to make it look like this is what it's going to be next year. This patio I'm sitting on is going to be 8 centimeters higher than I am right now. And the other side of the world is going to get the same increase. Isn't that crazy, right? But how is this tied to fossil fuels? Well, for those of you that don't know, let me take a position first. I will defend that oil is not a fossil fuel to the day I die, unless I'm presented with extremely different information with massive proof, okay? That does not mean that I mean that we should be driving gas vehicles. Both my vehicles, unfortunately, rely 100% on gas. When electric vehicles are marketed to the same price as a gas vehicle, I'll go ahead and get an electric one, all right? But we need charge stations everywhere, et cetera, et cetera. So when we get there, I'll be there. And I think that we could use much better Stan Meyer's technology than what we use today in our electric cars. But that's a whole separate conversation, which is embedded in many of my episodes. But in 1894, as I remember it, the Rockefellers went to a big giant convention. I even think it was like Geneva, but I'm not quite sure. I can't remember right. And they were able to get crude oil classified as a fossil fuel. And I read the paper on that moment, and what they said was, because it had oxygen in it, it was once alive and classified as a fossil fuel. It was something that was alive, it died, and turned into this stuff called crude oil. Now, if you ask, chemists and geologists, sure, you can take a plant and rot it down, and it will come into a combustible methane material. And they say, okay, well, if you crush methane, you can make it into crude oil. Don't forget that. The problem with that classification, and part of there was a group that met for like 2 years straight, off and on. It was a geological group of the United States of America meeting with all the other big heads of state around the world. But our head of state was said to have laughed at the concept that crude oil was a fossil fuel. And because some of the guys had never contemplated that it wasn't, and so they really punched in the conversation and said, well, how can you say that? And the guy looked at him, and he looked at a couple of guys that knew, and he looked at this new guy, or group of new guys that didn't know, and he said, well, all fossils in the world stop at 16,000 feet. There's no more life after 16,000 feet. Not a fossilized trilobite, nothing. Well, that's only 3 miles down, right, roughly? But Russia's dug oil out of the ground at 8.5 miles, right? I'm sure it's even further now. So oil exists way down below the fossil line. Now, that's not conclusive proof it's not a fossil. Maybe somehow crude oil comes out of old fossil stuff and it falls way, way down there. Miles and miles and miles. Oh, but wait. I mean, there's gravity pulling down, right? So it makes sense, right? But most of that mantle crust stuff is pushing up. That's why you get volcanoes and geysers and all that good stuff. All that stuff is crushing itself down there. So typically a vector on the outside of a pie slice pushes out, not in. Still not quite there, right? So let's look at the theory. And this guy who was giving this presentation said they found out, he said 1979. In fact, this was a presentation given by a chaplain of some of the Alaska pipeline digging. He was just a chaplain, and he said that he was brought into the upper echelon of the executive staff and sort of had this stuff shared with him. This is a different conversation. And he said within a few years of gaining their trust, and he goes, I don't know why I gained their trust. He goes, it must be because I was a chaplain. They started sharing with me the fact that oil is not a fossil fuel, and they've known it since 1979. And so my ears perk up, and I'm like, well, what did you find out in 1979? That's pretty recent, right? Well, someone had finally figured out the absolute algorithm, and I can assume that this was figured out maybe 100 years earlier, that they had figured out that there's a natural conversion of methane gas into crude oil, and that those subatomic particles are an ample supply in our sun. Now, methane gas is made of 1 carbon atom and 4 hydrogen atoms. Well, hydrogen is the primary component of the sun. Primary component of the sun. The other primary component of the sun is helium, and the rest is a bunch of other tiny smidgens of other chemicals, one being oxygen. And it's funny, when you look at crude oil, the amount of oxygen in a crude oil particle is about the same percentage as the oxygen in the sun. Infinitesimal, fraction of a percent. So they use this tiny fraction of a percent of oxygen to say that it was alive at one point and get that fossil designation. Once they had fossil designation, by the way, crude oil prices went up for the first time since they were dug out of the ground. It's because it was a limited resource all of a sudden in the eyes of the people. But now if you're going to crush a methane particle, what are you going to crush it with? Probably not going to crush it with more hydrogen. It's a gas. You're going to crush it with carbon. More carbon atoms. When you take a methane atom and you crush it with more carbon, you start adding carbon atoms to the orbital patterns of the methane gas, and you start getting an inverted particle which has a lot more carbon and a little bit of hydrogen. And that's where you get crude oil. Crushing methane gas with carbon creates crude oil. And this is why when we drill completely dead a well, it fills back up again. This has been the case all over the world. Saudi Arabia has capped off things and they fill right back up again. 100% full. Well, there's not new dinosaurs dying down there. There's not new ferns, prehistoric ferns dying down there and being carbonized, right? You could maybe assert that there's gigantic mother lodes down there and they're just making their way up because there's a hole now on the surface of the earth. But what do we do when we refine gas? We refine gas by boiling it and getting rid of the carbon atoms that were added to the original octane of methane. There's a big pipe at refineries. At the bottom of the pipe is the heavier stuff with more carbon atoms. At the top of the pipe is the higher octane stuff where you get your jet fuels and your Formula One fuels. And in the middle you get normal gasoline, octanes, unleaded, leaded. You get various versions of unleaded, and you get diesel fuel underneath that, which you can put a match out. Jet fuel's underneath that. Kerosene's underneath that, right? The electric universe establishes the relationship between the sun and the earth and all their bodies. It's why the moon rings like a bell, because it's hollow. Now, no one has hit the earth with a gigantic object loud enough to make it ring like a bell. But there have been experiments with things like HARP communicating through the surface of the earth to submarines on the other side of the planet. They brag about that. Well, if it was a nickel core, it ain't going to work. All right? But why do they tell you the earth has a nickel core? Because you can have a compass in your hand and it points north and south, and there's this electromagnetic pole going around Earth, later classified as the Van Allen belts. Well, what makes more sense? A nickel core that's supposedly spinning and creating this crazy magnetic field, or a purely electric plasma ball that exudes out of the South Pole and comes back into the North Pole, making all of our compasses go in the right direction? That makes a hell of a lot more sense than a nickel core. That correlates with the Navy and RCA in the late 70s. That correlates with everything that the electrical cosmologists have discovered and believe and have theorized. And they believe, look, we're just observing it right now. The proof is in the pudding, right in front of your face. Now, where else do we see electricity all over our planet? Well, a lot of you know about the Fibonacci pattern or the golden mean. I'll try to put some pictures up of plants that have them, right? But rose petals come out in this beautiful spiral. There's several little cactus that do it. There's several little plants that do it. We have them all over California constantly. Even the thorns that come out of the stem of a rose bush, if you look down the barrel of a stem, they're coming out in a perfect circle all the way up. It's everywhere. Now, the golden mean shows up in a lot of other ways, which I won't get into, but the most exciting place is life itself. And where does life get its nutrients from, especially plant life, I should say? Well, I know it's in seashells and that kind of stuff, but a plant is harnessed to the surface of the earth, looking up constantly, right? So the plasma core that is there exudes out in a very minute way. And they've talked about this for years, and that there's this opposite force coming out of the earth. And they've tracked it a couple times. When I was a kid, they did a few news specials on it and said, well, there's this mysterious force that comes out of the earth at the same time gravity pulls you down. Well, it could be a number of things. It could be escaping, subatomic plasma particles. Could be ether bouncing off the earth. Could be whatever it is. But look at the fact that a plant that really exudes this golden mean is really just sort of an eyeball looking straight up from the earth. And as the earth sends up these electric signals, well, there it is, right there in your face. It goes up the root of a rose bush and comes up the stalk and spins those branches out. It spins the thorns out. And when it gets to the bud, oh, it's a heyday, man, because there's not a lot of resistance at the bud level. It will do exactly what the electricity says to do. But now think about the fact that we are antennas, right? We're giant DNA balls, right? And DNA are made like little antennas. Well, where did the double helix spiral come from? Looks like a golden mean when you look right down its barrel. Now, they swim all over our bodies today, but maybe when the very first ones were created, that's how they came about. Whether it be intelligent design or something from nothing or some crazy lightning bolt Prometheus thing, right? Carbon and hydrogen are the two most frequent atoms in the universe. Oil is made of those two things. Why does it have oxygen in it? Well, come on. We have an atmosphere with oxygen. We usually don't pump it out of the ground without exposing it to oxygen. There's oxygen bubbles all on the surface of the Earth's mantle. So, of course, a minute fraction of a percent, just like the sun, captures a little bit of oxygen. It's taken into a certification process in 1894, and they go, yeah, man, looks like it was alive. Some of you will remember Mexico City having a massive explosion downtown because the sewers weren't draining properly, and all of the waste from human beings was turning into pure methane gas. And it finally exploded, blew up the streets really bad, hurt some people. That's just the raw sheer power of methane. When a cow farts, methane, right? When volcanoes erupt, all that crazy stuff comes out. Sulfuric acid clouds and methane clouds and all kinds of stuff. It's where CO2 is all blamed on stuff, right? Because methane burns what's left. Hydrogen molecules burn off, and the carbon's the only thing that's left. So here's the other one for you. If they are correct in the fact that the bowels of all planets and our suns all have plasma cores, Again, remember, the interior of the sun is noted as being a lot cooler than the surface. That doesn't make any sense if the surface is just the surface and the inside is where all the fusion is happening. It would be absolutely exponentially hotter inside the sun than the outside. I'm sure someone will come with some bullshit theory why it's the opposite, but it's not true. Okay? But think about, if you were to ask an astronomer, why is Jupiter made of mostly hydrogen gas? Why is Saturn so gaseous that it doesn't have enough density to sink in the ocean? It would float on the ocean is how they say it. And there's Neptune and Uranus and those two, right? So you have some gas giants out there. Well, if you ask the astronomy community that's gone through normal astronomy school and a normal indoctrination, they tell you that those are young planets that haven't pulled in and created a crust for themselves. How does something get really massive and really young at the same time in our model of the universe? It would seem that everything would have to start off small and then gain the mass to become large, right? I mean, Jupiter's the cosmic vacuum cleaner for us, right? It grabs all the big meteorites that are coming in, some that are the size of Earth, which is terrifying. But they tell you that they're young planets. And I'm going to suggest the complete opposite. What would happen to Earth if it kept expanding? I think, depending on the exponential algorithm of its interior, remember the dartboard's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and everyone's playing darts. More people are playing darts constantly, right? And it's getting hit by more and more of the particles from the sun, whether it be by way of gravity wells or just sheer emissions. Doesn't matter. It's getting bigger. It's injecting us. Well, we can't amass enough crust from space particles to continually cover up this expansion. Eventually, billions of years from now, the Earth would erupt. Its interior would break out, and there's not enough crust to cover it, and it too would turn into a gas giant. And the more you become a giant, the more you vacuum more stuff from the sun itself, as well as the universe itself. And so you might lose your illustrious, electrical view of Earth, but it'd still be a swimming ball of dust because it's constantly collecting stuff, and it's just going to get worse and worse and worse until all these little planets are going to turn into what Jupiter is. Why does it have more hydrogen? Well, the sun's made of hydrogen. It's giving off its hydrogen. It's being collected by Jupiter. Simple math. That's why Arthur C. Clarke flipped it into a star in 2010 in Space Odyssey. Everybody asked that question in astronomy. Well, what if we lit it on fire and it turned into a sun? Well, that's what Arthur C. Clarke did. So that's a little bit of food for thought. But if you're interested in this field of electrocosmology, and this is interesting to you because you're you dig the subject and you've never heard of this, definitely go look it up. There are YouTube videos for hours and hours and hours, but I would definitely suggest, if you want to learn the most about Tesla and the most about Faraday and all the guys in between, I mean all of them in between, go look up Eric Dollard, Dollard. He's a very eccentric guy, but he's a good guy. His whole thing is to read books to you. He has his own theories, but they're very small. And you don't need any of his theories to really have him blow your mind. Go research him as well. Go look up Expanding Earth. It's mind-blowing. And go look at all the other Expanding Earth algorithms for the moon, moons of Jupiter, Mars. And take a look. And just give me your opinion, right? But this is an emerging field of cosmology. If you're into that and you're going to go into that as a study to have a job teaching or something, you probably want to get on bandwagon pretty quick because, again, we haven't had a giant shift in science for a long time, and the internet is strangling science right now, and the colleges have done a beautiful job strangling science as well. So people like Neil deGrasse Tyson aren't doing anybody any favors. Having the robot Stephen W. Hawking continually write books, living in his past, it's not doing us any favors. We're not having any epiphanies in science right now, besides robotics and VR and that kind of stuff, which are good things too to study, but and AI and all that. But this is where you get back into physical sciences and really pioneer a whole new thing. There's plenty of scientists already out there that are into it. I haven't researched if there's any books about it. I'm sure there's a lot of self-published books on it because you can't get good knowledge out of major publishers anymore, and they're all dying anyway. But I think you feel me. That's all I got on that topic. Thought thought I'd throw it out there. Been wanting to do this one for quite a while. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of controversy in the comments. Anyway, if you like the series, please subscribe. If you like the episode, please like. That's all I'm going to say today. Take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over and out.